AITA for not splitting the surprise Thanksgiving bill. So, this year, my father-in-law Phil suggested that we host Thanksgiving. To give some background, we've never hosted Thanksgiving before. In fact, we've never even spent Thanksgiving with my in-laws because we live in a different state and have always had our own little family traditions here. But this year was different. My husband and I recently moved to a new house in a new state, which conveniently places us right between Phil and my brother-in-law Bill's family. FIL thought it was the perfect opportunity for us to be the middle ground for everyone. Since we now have a slightly bigger house with a bit more space, it did kind of make sense, and honestly, we were a little flattered they wanted to come here, so we agreed. What could go wrong? Fast forward to the planning phase, the head count ended up being 12 people in total. Me, my husband, our two kids, Phil, Nil, my Bill and his wife, their two kids, and my other brother-in-law, the unmarried one, and his girlfriend. Not a massive group, but definitely the largest I'd ever cooked for. We were already feeling a little nervous about hosting such a big gathering, but Phil was super insistent that it would be fine, and he assured us that everyone would pitch in. We'll all work together, he said. You don't need to worry about a thing. So, I started asking everyone what dishes they'd like to bring or help prepare, thinking it would be a collaborative effort. That's when things started to get interesting. Phil and Mill announced that they wanted to make 8 casseroles. Yes, you read that right, 8 casseroles. Apparently, these are family tradition dishes that absolutely had to be on the table or Thanksgiving would be ruined. I suggested we could maybe pare it down to, 3 or 4 casseroles, especially since our kitchen is not exactly massive, and we'd already planned to make green beans, mashed potatoes, and of course, the turkey. But no, they were adamant. Everyone will be so disappointed if we don't have them all, Mill said, with this kind of sad, guilt-inducing tone that made me feel like I was already ruining the holiday. So, I caved. Now, let me paint you a picture of the casserole situation. It wasn't like they had some streamlined, efficient game plan. Oh no. Each casserole required its own insane list of ingredients, most of which they didn't bring with them. I mean, they brought some stuff, but they kept realizing they'd forgotten things and would ask if we had random ingredients like Worcestershire sauce, smoked paprika, or heavy cream. And of course, they also wanted to use our butter and seasonings because it's just easier. Which, fine, I get it, it's Thanksgiving. But then Phil started making these little passive-aggressive comments about how much they had spent on the ingredients they did bring, which made me feel like I was hosting an event where they were doing me some huge favor. And I'm just standing there like, you insisted on making 8 casseroles. No one asked for this. Meanwhile, Phil kept making these random trips to the store and coming back with the most bizarre stuff. Like, at one point, he bought a whole pineapple peeler because he decided he wanted to make some kind of pineapple dessert that he never ended up making. He also bought stuff for caramel apples completely out of nowhere, which was weird because nobody asked for or even mentioned caramel apples. Half the stuff he bought didn't get used, and I have no idea what his thought process was. I think he just panicked every time he walked into the store and grabbed things he thought felt festive. Now, let's talk about the actual cooking. My kitchen, while functional, is not equipped to handle 8 casseroles, a turkey, green beans, mashed potatoes, pies, and whatever else people randomly decided to contribute. There were pots and pans and casserole dishes everywhere. Phil and Mill kept trying to direct traffic like they were Gordon Ramsay in Hell's Kitchen, barking out instructions to everyone and insisting that things had to be done their way. Every time I tried to offer help or suggest an alternative, Phil would give me this look like, "Sweetie, I know what I'm doing." At one point, I watched him use my good kitchen scissors to cut open a package of raw bacon, and I swear I almost had a stroke. On top of that, my Bill's wife, who is lovely but super high maintenance, decided she needed to make some kind of special cranberry sauce because she doesn't like the canned stuff. Which is fine, except she took up an entire counter with her cranberry station and kept asking if we had things like orange zest, fresh ginger, and a microplane. Lady, I don't even know what a microplane is. Meanwhile, her two kids were running around the house screaming and chasing each other while my 14-year-old son, who has ASD, was trying to block them out with noise-canceling headphones. My 17-year-old daughter, bless her heart, was trying to referee the chaos, but even she was starting to lose her patience. By the time the turkey was finally in the oven, I was ready to curl up in a corner with a bottle of wine and cry. But the drama didn't stop there. While Phil and Mill were laser-focused on their casserole mission, they kept reminding me about how important it was that the turkey was done just right. Phil made a big show of checking the oven every 20 minutes, even though I had a meat thermometer and had it under control. "You don't want to dry it out," he kept saying, as if I hadn't cooked a turkey before in my life. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, dinner was ready. The table was completely overloaded with food. I mean, there was no room for drinks or even plates because we had 8 casseroles, a massive turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans, cranberry sauce, rolls, and pies. Everyone sat down, and for about 30 seconds, there was silence as people started digging in. Then Phil leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, the turkey's a little dry, but at least the casseroles turned out great." I thought my husband was going to flip the table. After dinner, everyone just kind of scattered, leaving me and my husband to deal with the aftermath. The kitchen looked like a war zone. There were dirty dishes stacked so high I couldn't see the sink. Half the casseroles were barely touched because there was so much food, and everyone was already full by the time they got to them. And Phil kept wandering around saying things like, "Well, we'll have leftovers for days." As if we were the ones who wanted all those casseroles in the first place. After the chaotic whirlwind that was hosting Thanksgiving, I thought I'd seen it all. The 8 casseroles, the mountain of dirty dishes, Phil's random pineapple peeler and caramel apple ingredients, it all felt like something straight out of a sitcom. But as the evening wound down and everyone began saying their goodbyes, I realized that the chaos wasn't over yet. Oh no, there was one final plot twist waiting to unfold, and it was, in many ways, the most baffling part of the entire day. It all started as we were cleaning up the aftermath of the Thanksgiving feast. I was in the kitchen, elbow deep in soapy water, trying to scrub mashed potatoes off a casserole dish that, to my knowledge, had never even been used during the meal. My husband was helping pack up leftovers with Mill, and Phil was lingering around the living room, chatting with the guests who were still hanging out. Everyone seemed full, happy, and most importantly ready to leave. Except, as one of my brothers-in-law, the married one with kids, was getting ready to head out, he casually pulled my husband and my other BL, the unmarried one, aside for what I assumed was a quick goodbye. I wasn't really paying attention at first. I was in the kitchen, elbow deep in the aftermath of Thanksgiving, trying to tackle the endless sea of dishes while simultaneously discovering new horrors left behind by the meal. Someone, for reasons beyond my understanding, had managed to spill gravy in my silverware drawer. Gravy in the drawer. I was muttering to myself about how that even happened when I heard my husband's voice from the other room. It wasn't just his voice, it was that tone. The tone that means something absolutely ridiculous has just been said. "Wait, what?" he asked, his voice sharp with surprise and the slightest edge of disbelief. I froze mid-scrub, dish still in hand, and craned my neck toward the living room. There he was, standing near the couch, eyebrows raised and his mouth slightly open, as though someone had just informed him that aliens were real, and they were planning on taking the leftovers with them. His expression was so stunned, so genuinely taken aback, that for a moment I thought I'd misheard. My husband rarely reacts like that. It takes a lot to catch him off guard, but there he was, visibly trying to process whatever bombshell had just been dropped. I glanced at my unmarried Bill, who was standing a few feet away with his arms crossed, shifting uncomfortably on his feet like someone who had been dragged into a conversation he wanted no part of. Whatever this was, it wasn't your typical post-Thanksgiving chit-chat. I walked a little closer, trying to stay unobtrusive, and then I heard it. Bill number 1 had just brought up the idea of splitting the bill for Thanksgiving. Not casually, not as an offhand comment, but as a fully formed suggestion. He was explaining that, because hosting and groceries were so expensive, it only seemed fair for him, my husband, and their younger brother, the unmarried Bill, to share the costs evenly. According to him, this wasn't just a kind gesture, it was the logical solution. And to make sure it was all handled fairly, Phil had apparently volunteered to send out itemized receipts via Venmo so everyone could reimburse him directly. I swear, in that moment, time slowed down. I replayed the words in my head: split the bill, send receipts. For Thanksgiving, I had to grip the edge of the counter to steady myself as the sheer absurdity of it sank in. The kicker, this wasn't something anyone had discussed ahead of time. This wasn't a family agreement or a pre-planned arrangement. It was casually dropped into the conversation at the end of the night, when everyone was stuffed, tired, and ready to head home, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. My husband's face said it all. This was not, in any way, normal. And then, as if things couldn't get any weirder, I realized that Bill number 1 genuinely thought he was being helpful. He seemed to believe he was doing us a favor by suggesting this, like it was a benevolent gesture to ease the burden on my husband and me after a long day of hosting. He even mentioned that, since he hadn't brought a dish because of his long travel and late arrival, he felt it was only right to contribute financially instead. It took me a moment to realize that he had absolutely no idea this was all Phile's idea. He genuinely thought this was to help us out, not to line Phile's pockets or compensate him for expenses that, frankly, nobody asked him to incur in the first place. The more I thought about it, the more absurd it became. Phil hadn't hosted. He hadn't bought the turkey, or the pies, or the mashed potatoes. He hadn't paid for the drinks or the desserts, and he certainly hadn't lifted a finger to clean up the mountain of chaos he left behind in my kitchen. He had, however, insisted on 8 casseroles and gone on several unnecessary store runs, returning with random items like caramel apple ingredients and that ridiculous pineapple peeler. Yet now, somehow, he was framing this as a reasonable request, as if the 3 married men should be expected to foot the bill for the entire meal. It didn't matter that the women had done most of the actual cooking or that none of this was discussed in advance. Phil had decided, and that was that. My husband didn't know what to say. He just stood there, blinking, caught between the sheer audacity of what was being asked and the awkwardness of trying to handle this without causing a scene. After a few long seconds of silence, he stammered out something vague like, "We'll talk later," his voice strained in that way it gets when he's holding back his frustration. Bill number 1, completely oblivious to the tension he'd just unleashed, nodded cheerfully and headed for the door with his wife and kids in tow, blissfully unaware of the powder keg he'd left smoldering in our living room. That left Phil, now comfortably ensconced on the couch, humming to himself as he packed up leftovers. And when I say leftovers, I don't mean a modest portion or two, no. This man was loading up. He had brought along a small mountain of Tupperware containers, apparently with the intention of taking home as much food as possible. I watched from the kitchen as he scooped enormous portions of green bean casserole, mashed potatoes, and turkey into container after container, his demeanor casual, as though he hadn't just tried to stick us with a Venmo bill for half the groceries. At one point, he even grabbed the serving spoon from the sweet potato casserole, which barely had a quarter of it left, and dumped the rest into a container without a second thought. It was as if he decided that anything left on the table was fair game for his personal stash, regardless of the fact that we were the ones who'd paid for the turkey, the pies, and most of the essentials. And then, as if this scene couldn't get any more absurd, Phil decided it was time to explain the receipts. I heard his voice float into the kitchen, calm and matter-of-fact, as though he were delivering a financial report. "Well," he began, "I'll exclude the cost of the drinks, since those were just for your household." He said it like he was doing us some enormous favor, graciously removing the one thing that could not, by any stretch of logic, be considered a communal expense. "But we'll need to include the extra butter and heavy cream, since those went into the casseroles." I stood frozen in place, dish towel in hand, listening in stunned silence as he continued. He was itemizing everything. Not just the big-ticket items like the turkey or the produce. He was breaking it down to the smallest details, including herbs and spices, most of which, I knew for a fact, had come from my own pantry. I could feel my frustration mounting as he went on, casually mentioning the cost of things like garlic powder and paprika, as though he hadn't rummaged through my spice rack for half of the meal's ingredients. And then came the piece de resistance. He actually mentioned the pineapple peeler. The pineapple peeler. The very item that had been purchased during one of Phil's inexplicable grocery store excursions and never even used. He said it with the same tone one might use to discuss a necessary kitchen expense, like roasting pans or cooking utensils, as if we were all expected to chip in for a tool that no one else had asked for or even touched. At that point, something inside me snapped. I've always tried to stay out of my husband's family drama, letting him handle the weird dynamics and navigating the occasional ridiculousness on his own. But this was a bridge too far. The sheer absurdity of the situation was impossible to ignore, and after spending the entire day biting my tongue, I couldn't stay silent any longer. I walked into the living room, trying my best to keep my voice calm and neutral, and said, "This is very different from how my family handles Thanksgiving." I chose my words carefully, hoping to keep the conversation civil. In my family, contributions are usually the dishes you bring, and everything is established ahead of time. I thought I was being fair. I wasn't attacking anyone or trying to stir up more drama. I just wanted to point out how unusual this whole setup was. But Phil immediately bristled, his tone shifting to that familiar mix of defensiveness and justification that I've come to recognize over the years. "Well, we just thought everyone could contribute," he said, as though this whole everyone splitting the bill idea was some long-standing family tradition rather than a last-minute demand he'd dropped out of nowhere. I took a deep breath, trying to stay patient, and pointed out the obvious flaw in his logic. "If everyone is supposed to contribute," I said, "shouldn't that include all the people who ate at the table, not just the 3 married men splitting the costs?" I gestured toward the now empty dining room, where the rest of the family had enjoyed the meal without a single mention of splitting expenses. "And if we're going to go down this road," I added, "shouldn't the women who actually cooked most of the food get a say in how this is handled?" Phil kept doubling down, muttering something about how expensive groceries are these days, as if he hadn't been the one insisting on 8 casseroles and buying random things like caramel apple ingredients. I could tell my husband was trying to defuse the situation, but it was so awkward. Emil was conveniently nowhere to be found during this conversation, and the unmarried Bill was standing in the corner looking like he wished he could disappear into the floor. Eventually, Phil packed up his Tupperware and left, saying he'd send out the receipts in the morning. My husband and I just stood there in silence, too stunned to even process what had just happened. When the house was finally empty, my husband sat down at the table, looked at me, and said, "What the hell was that?" I didn't have an answer. I mean, I've seen some wild family dynamics in my time, but this was a new level of ridiculous. Update. The next morning, the fallout from Thanksgiving truly began. True to his word, Phil sent out the receipts bright and early, as if the entire family was waiting on tenterhooks to see the grand financial breakdown of the previous day's chaos. My husband, still groggy and nursing his first cup of coffee, opened the email on his phone and immediately let out a low groan. I didn't even need to ask what it was. I knew. This was the infamous Venmo bill we'd been dreading, the one Phil had teased with his late-night leftovers commentary about butter, cream, and pineapples. The receipts were as detailed and absurd as I'd feared. They included everything. Every single ingredient for the 8 casseroles, down to the spices that had clearly come from my pantry. Phil had somehow even managed to list individual items from his bizarre grocery trips, things like the pineapple peeler, which had gone untouched, and the caramel apple supplies that sat unused on my counter. True to his word, he'd left out the drinks, magnanimously excluding the cost of the wine we'd bought specifically for the meal. But that tiny concession did little to make the rest of it any less infuriating. The total amount was jaw-dropping. Somehow, Phil had managed to rack up a bill that rivaled the GDP of a small country, all in the name of Thanksgiving. My husband stared at the list for a few moments, quietly processing the sheer audacity of it, before shaking his head and pulling out his phone. Without even discussing it with me, though he already knew exactly how I felt, he called his brothers to put an immediate stop to this nonsense. The first call was to Bill number 1, the married one who had unknowingly walked into this mess with his cheerful suggestion of splitting costs. My husband explained the situation to him, starting with the fact that Phil was the one driving this whole split-the-bill idea, and not some altruistic gesture to help us out. According to my husband, Bill number 1 was mortified when he realized what had actually happened. He had honestly believed that he was pitching in to help us cover hosting expenses. not subsidizing FIL's casserole crusade. The poor guy was caught completely off guard and immediately apologized for even bringing it up the night before. He promised not to send a dime, which was a relief, but it also left me feeling a little bad for him. He'd been used as an unwitting pawn in Phil's ridiculous game, and now he was stuck dealing with the fallout too. The second call was to the unmarried Bill, who had been the most visibly uncomfortable during the previous night's discussion. My husband didn't even get halfway through explaining the situation before Bill number 2 started laughing. Apparently, he had already decided he wasn't paying a single cent. He thought the whole thing was so ridiculous that he hadn't taken it seriously to begin with. He even joked about how he was tempted to ask Phil to reimburse him for the gas money he spent driving to our house. It was a small moment of levity in an otherwise infuriating situation, but at least we knew we had his support. With his brothers firmly on the same page, my husband sent a polite but firm reply to FIL's email, making it clear that no one would be paying the requested reimbursements. He didn't go into too much detail, just a short note about how hosting is a shared effort, and any contributions to the meal should have been discussed ahead of time. I could tell he was trying to walk the fine line between standing up for himself and avoiding an all-out family feud, but I knew it was only a matter of time before Phil responded. For the rest of the day, we waited. Every time my husband's phone buzzed, we both tensed up, expecting a passive-aggressive email or a guilt-laden text message from Phil, but surprisingly, nothing came. It was almost eerie. Phil wasn't exactly the type to let things go quietly, so his silence felt more like the calm before the storm than a genuine resolution. Meanwhile, I found myself reflecting on the whole ordeal. Hosting Thanksgiving had always felt like a rite of passage, something that symbolized a certain level of adulthood and family togetherness. But after this experience, I couldn't imagine ever volunteering for it again. The stress of cooking for 12 people, the chaos of juggling multiple dishes in a not-so-big kitchen, and the constant intrusion of FIL's helpful but unsolicited advice had been bad enough. But the final straw was the financial debacle. Never in a million years did I think I'd be dealing with receipts after a holiday meal. It felt so transactional, so cold, and so completely opposite of the warm, familial spirit Thanksgiving was supposed to represent. The worst part was knowing that this was just par for the course with my in-laws. FIL had a way of bulldozing over boundaries, framing his decisions as though they were in everyone's best interest while leaving a trail of awkwardness and resentment in his wake. And somehow, he always managed to avoid taking responsibility for it. If you confronted him directly, he'd either act like you were overreacting or spin the situation to make himself the victim. It was a lose-lose scenario, and I could already see the writing on the wall for future holidays. But as I stood in my now-clean kitchen, looking out over the remaining leftovers Phil hadn't packed up, I made a decision. I was done. Hosting Thanksgiving, dealing with the endless drama, trying to navigate my in-laws' bizarre family dynamics, it wasn't worth it. Next year, we'd keep things simple. Maybe we'd go out to a restaurant, or maybe we'd stay home with a frozen pizza and a movie. Whatever we did, it wouldn't involve casseroles, receipts, or FIL's unsolicited advice. It would just be us, enjoying a peaceful holiday without the weight of expectations or the threat of financial breakdowns hanging over our heads. For now, though, I was content to let my husband handle the rest. It was his family, after all, and he was more than capable of dealing with FIL's antics. As for me, I poured myself a glass of wine, grabbed a slice of pie, and sat down at the dining table, silently congratulating myself on surviving what would undoubtedly go down as the most ridiculous Thanksgiving in family history.